Harlem didn't explode that night. It did something far more unsettling. Police cars arrived without urgency, without noise, without the kind of chaos that usually followed a serious operation. One by one, streets were sealed, corners were held, movement slowed to a crawl, and at the center of the tightening perimeter stood Bumpy Johnson, not running, not arguing, not surrounded by bodyguards. Just waiting. This wasn't a raid meant to shock. It was a test. A measured show of authority designed to see what would happen when pressure was applied slowly, deliberately, in full view of the neighborhood. The police expected tension. They expected whispers, crowds, maybe resistance. Harlem had a reputation for reacting loudly when lines were crossed. But instead, the opposite happened. Storefronts went quiet. Conversations stopped. People stepped back into doorways and windows, not in fear, but in awareness. No one shouted. No one intervened. No one reached for a phone. The street didn't erupt. It shut down. And that silence carried weight. Inside the perimeter, officers began to realize that this operation wasn't unfolding the way their training prepared them for. There was no disorder to contain, no emotion to control, no justification building itself through noise and movement. Every second that passed without reaction made the situation heavier, more exposed, more political. Bumpy Johnson didn't speak, he didn't signal, he didn't need to, because the street had already answered for him. By the end of the night, nothing dramatic had happened. No arrest, no confrontation, no headlines waiting at dawn. And yet, everyone who witnessed it understood that something had shifted. A line had been tested, not with force, but with restraint. This story isn't about what the police did, it's about what Harlem refused to do, and why, in 1960, that refusal mattered more than any siren ever could. In 1960, New York wasn't trying to win a war in Harlem, it was trying to manage a balance. City officials understood that open confrontation brought consequences they couldn't always control, and the NYPD was under growing pressure to prove it could assert authority without triggering unrest. The answer wasn't speed or force, it was presence. That was the logic behind the operation that night. Instead of a sudden raid, officers moved into position slowly, almost casually. Patrol cars didn't flood the block at once. They arrived in intervals, parking at corners, narrowing exits, shaping the street without announcing intent. To an outsider, it might have looked like routine policing. To Harlem, it was unmistakable. Someone was being boxed in. That someone was Bumpy Johnson. By 1960, Bumpy occupied a space that law enforcement found difficult to define. He wasn't just a criminal figure. He was a stabilizing presence in a neighborhood the city feared losing control over. Violence around him was limited, predictable, and contained. That didn't make him acceptable. It made him manageable. And manageability mattered more than ideology in that moment. The decision to apply pressure instead of force reflected a strategic question within the department. What happens if we remove him without a plan for what comes next? Harlem wasn't a vacuum. If Bumpy disappeared suddenly, something else would rush in. Something less predictable, less contained. The city had seen that pattern before, and it rarely ended quietly. So the operation became a test, not of Bumpy's willingness to resist, but of Harlem's willingness to react. Officers were instructed to observe as much as to contain, to hold positions and wait, to let the neighborhood reveal its temperature. Was there anger? Fear? Movement? Would people gather? Would someone challenge the perimeter? Every small response would inform the next decision. What they didn't expect was nothing. As the pressure built, the street offered no cues, no escalation, no disruption. The environment remained unnervingly controlled, as if the neighborhood itself had agreed on a response without speaking. That absence of reaction unsettled the operation more than resistance ever could. Inside the perimeter, Bumpy Johnson remained still. He didn't acknowledge the officers beyond what was necessary. He didn't try to leave. He didn't attempt to communicate. In doing nothing, he allowed the situation to unfold entirely on the city's terms. A choice that quietly shifted responsibility back onto the police. Because once pressure is applied without resistance, the next move becomes harder to justify. And in 1960 Harlem, Justification mattered more than authority. As the night settled in, the perimeter stopped feeling temporary. The police cars weren't shifting anymore. Officers held their positions with the kind of patience that signaled intention, not uncertainty. Every exit from the block was covered. Every path led back to the same quiet center where Bumpy Johnson stood, unhurried and unremarkable in appearance, which made the moment even more conspicuous. People in Harlem didn't need instructions to understand what was happening. The message traveled without words. A glance from a doorway. A light switched off upstairs. A shopkeeper lowering his voice instead of his gait. This wasn't fear. It was coordination without coordination. A collective reading of the situation that required no leadership. The street adjusted itself. Traffic slowed, then vanished. Footsteps faded. Windows became watching points rather than places of reaction. The absence of movement created a strange clarity. Everyone knew the police were there, and everyone knew why, but no one gave them anything to respond to. From the officers' perspective, this was not the outcome they had prepared for. Crowd management depended on reaction, on noise, on momentum, on energy that could be redirected or suppressed. Silence removed all of that. With no crowd forming, there was no disorder to cite. With no resistance, there was no justification to escalate. That put the operation into a dangerous position. The longer the box stayed closed without incident, the more visible the police presence became. Each minute added weight. Neighbors weren't witnessing an arrest. They were witnessing a choice not being made. And in Harlem, people understood that hesitation from authority often meant uncertainty higher up the chain. Bumpy Johnson did nothing to break the silence. He didn't test the perimeter. He didn't provoke a response. He simply remained where he was, allowing the street to empty around him. In a way, the neighborhood had absorbed the pressure meant for him, neutralizing it through stillness. Radios crackled quietly. Short updates passed between units. The language changed. Words like monitor replaced words like move. The operation was still active, but its purpose was drifting. What had begun as containment was turning into observation. The box was closed. The target was contained. And yet, nothing was resolving. That unresolved state became the real threat, because without reaction, the police couldn't control the narrative. There would be no explanation for action if it suddenly came, and no justification for why it hadn't come sooner. Silence didn't just stall the operation. It exposed it. And in that exposure, the balance of pressure began to shift, not away from Bumpy Johnson, but onto the system that had decided to surround him and now had to explain why it was still waiting. Silence is usually a pause before something breaks. That night in 1960, it became the event itself. As the perimeter held, the street settled into a stillness that felt intentional, not empty, contained. The usual signals police relied on simply never appeared. No crowd formed, no argument started. No one crossed a line just to see what would happen. The neighborhood didn't test the boundary. It accepted it, and in doing so, stripped it of purpose. At the center of it all stood Bumpy Johnson. He didn't speak because there was nothing to add. The silence had already done the work. Every officer present could feel it. This wasn't fear-driven compliance. This was a collective decision not to participate. And that distinction mattered. Fear escalates. Silence forces restraint. For the NYPD, this created a tactical dead end. Operations like this depended on reaction. Even minimal resistance could justify decisive action. But with no reaction, the situation became exposed to scrutiny. Any move now would look unilateral, unprovoked, political. Minutes passed, then more. Officers shifted their weight. Radios stayed close to their mouths. Updates became repetitive because nothing was changing. The longer the street remained quiet, the clearer it became that escalation would not be met with chaos. It would be met with memory. People would remember who broke the silence first. That's what made the moment dangerous. A loud confrontation could be explained away. A quiet one could not. In a city already under a microscope, an arrest carried out against a backdrop of total calm risked looking excessive, unnecessary, even deliberate in the wrong way. Silence turned every potential action into a statement. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than anyone there. He had survived long enough to know when movement helped, and when it only gave the system something to react to. By doing nothing, he denied them that reaction. He forced the burden of decision entirely onto the police, and Harlem backed him, not with words, not with presence, but with absence. No witnesses stepped forward. No community leaders intervened. No one demanded anything. The street didn't plead, didn't protest, didn't perform. It simply withheld itself. That withholding created pressure where force had failed. Because now, if the police acted, they would own the outcome completely. There would be no disorder to blame, no escalation to justify, just a decision made in full view of a neighborhood that had chosen stillness. The silence wasn't passive. It was strategic, and by the time that became clear, the balance had already shifted. The question was no longer whether Bumpy Johnson would be arrested. It was whether the system could afford to break the quiet it had allowed to form. Hesitation doesn't announce itself, it shows up in what doesn't happen. By the time the silence had settled in, the operation was no longer moving forward. Officers remained in position, but the energy that had brought them there was gone. The radios stayed active, yet no new instructions arrived. The street hadn't forced a response, and now the system was struggling to justify one. Inside the perimeter, Bumpy Johnson waited without pressure. He wasn't being guarded more closely. He wasn't being approached. The moment had stalled, and in that stall, authority began to thin. At higher levels, the calculus changed. Every option carried risk. An arrest would have to be explained not only legally, but politically. There was no disorder to point to, no threat to public safety unfolding in real time. Acting now would look intentional, a deliberate decision to escalate in a situation that had remained calm. That kind of action invites questions. Who ordered it? Why now? And why here in front of a silent neighborhood that offered no resistance? The longer those questions lingered, the more dangerous the operation became. Silence turned the spotlight inward. Instead of controlling the street, the police were being observed. By residents, by potential witnesses, and by their own internal accountability. Small signs revealed the shift. Officers began adjusting their stance. Some returned to their cars. The perimeter loosened, not enough to signal retreat, but enough to suggest reevaluation. This wasn't defeat. It was risk management. The city had seen enough unrest to know how quickly optics could turn. An unnecessary show of force could undo months of fragile calm, and in 1960, calm was currency. Bumpy Johnson didn't press his advantage. He didn't test the loosening perimeter. He didn't offer compromise or demands. He simply allowed the hesitation to breathe. In moments like this, power belongs to the side that doesn't need to rush a conclusion. The system, on the other hand, did. Without a clear trigger, every second increased the likelihood that someone would ask why the operation was still happening at all. Hesitation became a signal in itself, a quiet admission that the situation had slipped beyond simple enforcement. And once authority hesitates in public, it rarely regains momentum without cost. By the end of the standoff, the question had shifted again. It was no longer about arresting one man. It was about whether forcing an outcome would damage the balance the city was trying to preserve. In that moment, restraint became the safer option. Not because the system had lost control, but because it understood exactly how fragile control really was. Nothing dramatic marked the end of the night. No commands were shouted. No sirens cut through the air. No one announced a decision. The perimeter simply began to dissolve. One patrol car eased away from its position. Another followed minutes later. Officers who had stood watch for hours returned to their vehicles without urgency, without explanation. To an outsider, it might have looked like a routine shift change. To Harlem, it was unmistakable. The pressure was gone. At the center of the block, Bumpy Johnson waited until the street returned to its normal rhythm. Only then did he move. No escort, no acknowledgement, no victory walk. He stepped away as quietly as the moment had unfolded, disappearing into a neighborhood that had already decided the night was over. By morning there was nothing to report. No arrest record circulated. No official statement was released. The operation existed only in fragments. in the memories of those who watched it form and then quietly abandon itself. For the police, it became a night that didn't require documentation. For Harlem, it became a reference point. What mattered wasn't what the police failed to do. It was what they chose not to force. In the days that followed, behavior shifted subtly. Surveillance became less visible. Encounters became indirect. The city didn't stop watching Bumpy Johnson, but it stopped testing him in public. The lesson had been absorbed. Pressure without justification creates exposure, not control. That night didn't elevate Bumpy into a myth. It clarified his position. He wasn't untouchable. He was too entangled in the city's balance to remove cleanly. And in 1960, cleanliness mattered. Harlem returned to its routines. Shops reopened. Conversations resumed. But beneath the surface, something had changed. The neighborhood understood that silence could carry weight, that withholding reaction could be more decisive than confrontation. When nothing happens, people assume nothing was decided. But that night a decision was made, not in favor of the police, not in favor of Bumpy Johnson, in favor of stability. And in a city built on noise, that choice, made quietly, without witnesses, became one of the loudest statements Harlem had ever delivered. What ended that night in 1960 wasn't a standoff, it was an experiment. The city had tested pressure without force, and Harlem had responded with something no manual prepared for. Discipline without noise, no outrage, no submission. Just a collective refusal to perform. And in that refusal, the balance of power became visible. This wasn't about Bumpy Johnson outmaneuvering the police. He didn't negotiate. He didn't threaten. He didn't even speak. The outcome wasn't shaped by what he did, but by what the street chose not to do on his behalf. That distinction matters, because power isn't always exercised through action. Sometimes it appears in restraint, in coordination that never announces itself, in a shared understanding that escalation only serves the system trying to provoke it. The silence of that street forced the city into a corner. Without disorder, there was no justification. Without reaction, there was no narrative to control. The system had to confront its own limits, not because it was challenged, but because it was denied participation. After that night, Harlem was approached differently. Less pressure, fewer public tests, more caution. The lesson had been learned quietly and applied carefully. This is why the story matters, not as a legend about a man who couldn't be arrested, but as a reminder that communities sometimes shape outcomes more than individuals ever could. When an entire street chooses stillness, authority has fewer options than it appears. And in 1960, Harlem's silence wasn't absence, it was strategy. A strategy powerful enough to end the night without a single word being spoken.